One of the quiet surprises about walking with people who are in between churches is how often prayer becomes the hardest part of faith. Not because people don't believe in God, not because they don't want to pray, but because prayer has become tangled with pressure, disappointment, or exhaustion. Again and again, I've sat across from mentees who assumed something was wrong with them because prayer no longer came easily. And what they didn't realize was that their struggle wasn't a failure, it was a signal, a sign that something deeper needed care. One mentee, I'll call her Jill, had served her church leadership for years. She was faithful, capable, and deeply committed. When she finally stepped away after a season of burnout, prayer didn't feel like relief. It felt like guilt. She said, "I sit down to pray," she told me, "and all I hear is everything I should be saying." Her prayer life had been shaped by public language, polished, hopeful, confident. But privately, she was grieving, angry, tired. And she didn't think those emotions belonged in prayer. And instead of correcting her, or handing her a prayer guide, which nothing wrong with those, I slowed the conversation down. I listened. I asked where she felt stuck, not where she felt weak. Then I gave her permission to pray prayers that would never be shared out loud. Her first assignment, if you will, wasn't to pray longer, it was to pray honestly. I suggested she write one sentence a day that she didn't try to fix. Some days it was raw, some days it was numb, some days it was just, "God, I don't feel anything." And over time, something shifted. Prayer stopped being a performance and became a place of safety. She didn't rediscover prayer by learning new words. She rediscovered it by reclaiming her voice. Another mentee, Mark, he described prayer like a muscle he'd lost. After leaving a church that demanded constant involvement, his spiritual energy was just gone. "I know prayer matters," he said. "I just don't have anything left." So what Mark needed wasn't motivation. He just needed rest. So we talked about how prayer had become one more task on an already overloaded life. He assumed that if he couldn't give prayer his best effort, it wasn't worth attempting at all. That all or nothing thinking kept him disconnected. And instead of asking him to commit to daily prayer time, I invited him to notice the moments when he already felt quiet, like driving home, sitting outside, or walking and waking up before the phone started going off. Prayer didn't have to be added to his life. It could be woven in. His practice became a single breath prayer during his commute. No journaling, no timer, just returning. Weeks later, he told me, "It's the first time prayer hasn't felt like pressure." Prayer came back not because he pushed harder, but because he stopped demanding more from himself than his soul could give. For Lena, another mentee, the hardest part of prayer was the silence. She had grown up in expressive worship environments where prayer was constant noise, music, voices, emotions. And then when she stepped away from church, the quiet felt a little unbearable. She said, "When I pray now," she said, "nothing happens." And then rather than filling the silence with answers, I stayed with her in the discomfort. We talked about how silence can feel threatening when we've trained to measure everything. God's presence by activity. No, I reminded her that stillness doesn't mean absence. Her practice was simple. You know, 2 minutes of quiet, 3 times a week. No expectations, just sitting there. At first, she hated it, but over time, she began to notice that the silence wasn't empty; it was spacious. Prayer became less about doing and more about being with God. What she found wasn't immediate clarity; it was just like trust. None of these mentees needed better theology. None of them needed stronger discipline. None of them needed to be told they weren't praying enough. What they needed was space. Space to listen to their own exhaustion. Space to speak without being corrected. Space to rest without being rushed. Space to re-engage when they were ready. Prayer didn't heal them by fixing their circumstances. It healed them by giving them a place to stay connected to God while everything else was being rebuilt. In between churches, prayer often becomes the rhythm that remains when everything else feels uncertain. Not because, it's impressive, but because it's accessible. Prayer doesn't require certainty. Prayer doesn't require clarity. Prayer doesn't require energy you don't have. It simply requires returning. If prayer feels hard right now, you're not failing, you're noticing. And noticing is often the first step to healing. God is not measuring your prayer life, He is meeting you in it, even here, even now, even in the in between.